little diner tucked along Maple Street was nothing special, just a humble, family-run spot with checkered tablecloths, the soft aroma of brewed coffee in the air, and the comforting sizzle of bacon coming from the back. It wasn't the kind of place that made headlines, nor one that people stumbled into expecting anything remarkable. But for Jake Carter, the owner, it was everything. Every morning, without fail, Jake would unlock the doors, flip the open sign, and begin the quiet routine of wiping down counters and greeting the familiar faces, truckers stopping in for a hot breakfast, office workers grabbing a quick bite before traffic, and older couples who moved at their own pace, sipping coffee like time was theirs alone. But out of all the regulars, one man never changed: Walter Hughes. Walter was 97 years old, a veteran who had walked through the darkest days of the past century and somehow kept walking. And every day, at exactly 8:30 a.m., he shuffled into the diner wearing the same old brown trench coat, his leather shoes long past their shine but still immaculately clean, polished like it was part of some sacred ritual. His hands, frail and trembling, would gently pull out the same chair in the far right corner, the one that faced the window where soft light spilled through the fogged glass. And every morning, without exception, he ordered the same meal: meatloaf, mashed potatoes without gravy, a slice of cornbread, and a black coffee. No substitutions, no chatter, just the same, every single day, like clockwork. Jake had grown used to it, accepted it as part of the rhythm of the place. But there was something about how Walter sat that always caught his eye. The old man's posture was never quite centered. He always angled himself slightly to the side, as if turned towards someone. At times, his lips would move, whispering softly, like he was speaking to someone only he could see. But there was never anyone there. At first, Jake chalked it up to age, just the private habits of someone who lived more in memory than in the present. But over time, the questions began to settle like dust in his mind. Why always that exact time? Why always the same meal? And more than anything, why did it always feel like Walter was waiting for someone who never came? Then, one bitter October morning, the silence began to break. A cold front had rolled in with a vengeance. Rain hammered against the windows, and sharp gusts of wind rattled the glass panes and tugged at the curtains. The diner was quieter than usual. Most folks had chosen to stay warm at home. But just as the clock hit 8:30, Walter arrived. His coat was soaked through, his hat pulled low over his wrinkled face. Jake, mid-pour at the coffee station, paused. Something felt different today, something he couldn't name. He took the coffee pot and approached Walter's table slowly, heart beating just a little faster. "Mr. Hughes," he said gently, "can I get you anything else today?" Walter looked up. His pale blue eyes, like an overcast sky just before snow, studied Jake's face with a kind of quiet intensity, as if searching for something deeper than politeness. After a long pause, he finally spoke, so softly that Jake had to lean in to hear. "Do you know what day it is?" Jake hesitated. It was just a Thursday, nothing unusual. Walter let out a sigh heavy, as if the weight of a world had just been confirmed. And then, for the first time in all the years Jake had known him, Walter did something he had never done before. He motioned to the empty seat across from him. "Would you sit with me, son?" Jake froze. He didn't know what surprised him more, the invitation or the fact that Walter had called him son. But there was something in the old man's voice, something worn and wounded and desperate to be heard. So Jake nodded. He slid into the seat, feeling as though he was stepping into another dimension, a place where time didn't tick but echoed. Walter picked up his coffee, took a sip, and stared at his still untouched plate. Then, in a voice rough like gravel, he said, 74 years ago today, my best friend died in my arms." Jake felt a chill settle deep in his chest. Walter tapped the table with his fingers, eyes drifting into someplace far beyond the diner walls. His name was James Holway, he continued. His voice grew steadier, like a man who had waited decades to finally speak. We were kids when we enlisted, just over 20, thought we were invincible, thought the war couldn't touch us. That kind of stupid bulletproof optimism only young men carry. Jake said nothing. There was nothing to say, only to listen. The diner seemed to grow quieter, the rain a distant hum. Walter's voice lowered, thick with memory. That morning was bitter cold. Just like today, we'd been in the trenches for weeks, no sleep, no hot food, just the sound of screaming and gunfire and death all around us. James, he stopped, swallowing hard. James was always the brave one, the funny one. Said one day we'd be old, sitting in a place like this, laughing about the stupid things we survived. A soft, humorless laugh escaped him. I thought he was nuts, but he believed it. Walter's fists tightened, resting on the table like stones. Then came the ambush. Our unit was caught out in the open. Machine guns lit up the sky like hellfire. I got hit in the shoulder. He paused, his eyes flickered. But James didn't make it? Jake felt his own throat tighten. Walter looked down at his trembling hands. Before he died, he grabbed my arm, blood all over me, and he made me promise. Jake leaned in, barely breathing. He said, "Eat one meal for me, every day. Don't let me be forgotten." The words struck like lightning. This wasn't habit. This wasn't senility. This was a vow, sealed with a dying breath and carried across 7 decades. Walter exhaled, eyes shimmering with grief and defiance. I've kept that promise for 74 years. And in that moment, Jake realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Walter Hughes wasn't a lonely old man. He was a soldier still standing watch, still honoring the fallen. One plate, one bite, one silent breakfast at a time. The words hit Jake like a punch to the chest. He felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. Every meal Walter had ever eaten at that booth, every slow bite, every sip of black coffee, hadn't been out of habit. It was a vow, a sacred promise, etched into his soul by the final breath of a dying friend. Walter straightened his back, and something shifted in his eyes, something between pain and pride, the look of a man who had carried both like old friends. I've kept that promise for 74 years, he said, his voice steady and worn like a soldier's uniform. Jake felt his throat tighten. The man sitting across from him wasn't just an old veteran lost in time. He was a living relic of history, flesh and blood molded by battles most had long forgotten. And for a moment, Jake was humbled to realize that he had been serving more than food all these years. He had been serving memory, a sacred ritual. Before he could speak, the front door of the diner burst open, slamming against the wall with a gust of wind and rain. The moment shattered. A tall man in a dark suit stepped in from the storm. His gaze was cold and sharp, sweeping the room until it landed on Walter like a blade finding its mark. The temperature seemed to drop. Walter's body tensed immediately. His hands, already fragile with age, began to tremble as he gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles turned white. The man approached slowly, a half-smile curling at his lips. "I've been looking for you for a long time, Sergeant Hughes." Jake froze. Sergeant Hughes? He'd never heard Walter's rank before. The name, spoken aloud, changed everything. Walter didn't respond at first. Then he swallowed hard, his voice strained and low. "You've got the wrong man," he said through clenched teeth. But the stranger only smirked and stepped closer. "I don't think I do, Sergeant." Silence fell over the diner like a heavy fog. There were only 3 people in the room, but the tension thickened until it felt like a crowd of ghosts was watching from the corners. Jake sensed it immediately. This wasn't just about old war stories. Something darker was rising to the surface. Jake took a step forward, placing himself between the two men, his voice calm but firm. "Who are you?" The man barely acknowledged him. "Someone looking for the truth." His gaze returned to Walter, eyes narrowing. "And I think it's time we had that talk, old man." Walter leaned back, the weight of the years settling on his shoulders. But in his face, there wasn't just weariness. There was acceptance, even a hint of surrender. He nodded slowly. "Sit down," he said. "You've been chasing me long enough. Might as well say what you came to say." Jake didn't sit. He remained standing, watching the stranger carefully as he removed a battered file from inside his coat. The papers were yellowed with age, folded and creased like something unearthed from a forgotten archive. The man laid it on the table, tapped his fingers once, then asked without hesitation, "You served in the 45th Infantry Division, didn't you?" Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way his eyes locked on the folders said it all. "There was a mission," the man continued, "classified. A unit cut off behind enemy lines. Officially, everyone was presumed dead." Jake held his breath. Walter didn't move. He stared at the folder like it might bite. "But you weren't dead, were you?" the man asked, leaning in. Still, Walter said nothing. Then, slowly, his voice emerged from somewhere deep and broken. "I don't talk about those days." The man nodded. "That's the problem. No one does." Jake's pulse was racing. For years, he'd seen Walter as just an old man with a tragic past and a stubborn routine, but now everything was unraveling, and behind Walter's silence, there was something enormous. Walter reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and opened the folder. Despite his age, there was precision in the way he unfolded the pages, like handling something sacred. His lips moved faintly as his eyes scanned the contents. Then, his breath caught. "You're looking in the wrong place," he muttered. The man raised an eyebrow. "Then where is it?" Walter closed his eyes and touched his forehead, as though trying to erase the images rising behind his eyelids. "In the ground," he whispered, "where the men who never came back are still waiting." Jake swallowed hard. The weight of those words crushed him. Walter leaned forward, his voice quieter now but sharp as a blade. "There were 7 of us when we were captured. Only 1 made it out." His eyes locked on the stranger's face. "That one was me." The truth hit like a cold wind. Jake stared at Walter, not as a fragile, lonely old man, but as a survivor carrying the darkness of an entire unit on his shoulders, a living witness to something no one else had ever spoken of. Walter's fingers tightened on the edge of the table again. His face remained unreadable, but his voice, steady and grave, carried the weight of ghosts. "They didn't take us as prisoners," he said. "They took us to an outpost, deep behind enemy lines, not to hold us, but to trade." Jake's breath caught. "Trade? For what?" Walter's eyes stared beyond the room, beyond the years. His voice dropped lower. "Information." The man across from him leaned forward slightly, sensing a shift. "What kind of information?" Walter didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped the wood of the table, soft and rhythmic. Tick, tick, tick. Like a countdown. Jake noticed it too, the change in Walter's eyes. A flash of something not just wounded, but dangerous. Things we were never meant to know. A chill slid down Jake's spine. Walter wasn't speaking vaguely. He was choosing his words with deadly precision. "They didn't torture us outright," Walter said. "They took us apart from the inside, one by one." He exhaled, trembling. James was the first. Jake felt his gut twist. He had always believed James had fallen in combat, but now that image shattered. James had been executed, not in the field, but in captivity, in front of his best friend. Walter's jaw tightened. They wanted me to break, to give them coordinates, names, strategy. I refused. Jake hadn't realized his hands were gripping the countertop until his knuckles turned white. Walter's eyes dropped. So, they made me watch. As they killed the others, one by one. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jake could hear only the rain outside, ticking like time itself. The man finally broke the silence. But you escaped, didn't you? Walter let out a bitter breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. No, he said. I didn't escape. Jake frowned. Then, how? Walter lifted his gaze, heavy with exhaustion and something worse, shame. I was let go. Jake's stomach turned cold. The man in the suit leaned in slightly, tension in his posture. Well, Walter didn't speak for a long moment. Then he inhaled slowly, his voice a blade honed by years of regret. Because I gave them a name. Jake felt his heart stop. He didn't want to hear the answer. He wasn't ready, but still the question escaped his lips, like a wound that needed to bleed. Who was it? Walter stared down at his trembling, time-worn hands. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, as if speaking the name aloud would summon a ghost. Thomas Caldwell. The name fell into the room like a death sentence. Jake had never heard it before, but something in Walter's voice, like a soul being torn from the inside, made the name feel heavy, like a headstone carved with regret. A bead of sweat slid down Walter's brow. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. Tommy, he said softly. He was just 19, straight out of training, sharp, fearless, always the first to volunteer. The man in the suit leaned in, his expression like ice. And you gave him up. Walter's jaw twitched, his breath caught. He didn't have a choice. Jake clenched his fists so tightly his nails bit into his palms. There's always a choice. Walter's eyes for the first time ignited with fury. A fire that had been buried for decades roared to life. You think I don't know that? He growled. You think I haven't lived that moment over and over? Every night for the last 74 years. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there. His voice broke, just for a moment, before he forced it steady again. They said all they needed was one name, just one, and they'd let me go. I didn't believe them. I couldn't. But I was starving, freezing. I'd lost so much blood I could barely stand, and then he paused, his eyes closing tightly like he was trying to shut out the memory, but it clawed its way back in anyway. They put a gun to my head. Jake's body went rigid. His breath trembled. Walter opened his eyes again, and they looked older than ever. Tired. Haunted. I was ready to die. Hell, I wanted to. But then they said something else. His hands curled tighter around the edge of the table. They told me if I didn't give them a name, they'd kill someone else, one of the others. Jake's mind reeled. It hadn't been his own life they threatened. It had been someone else's, someone still holding on. I thought, Walter said, his voice cracking, maybe if I gave them Tommy's name, they'd keep him alive, use him for intel, let him go later. I thought I could bargain, but I was wrong. The diner went still. Outside, a car hissed past on the wet street. The rain drummed against the glass. Inside, the sound of the refrigerator buzzed low, distant, but none of it could drown the heaviness that filled the air. Walter lowered his gaze, ashamed. James asked me to eat for him, but I don't just eat for James. I eat for all of them. Every meal is a punishment. The man in the suit reached into his coat and pulled out a thick folder, weathered with age. He placed it on the table. "We've spent years investigating what really happened to Caldwell," he said, and finally, Walter looked up. "You found out he died in that camp," he said flatly. The man shook his head. "No, he didn't." It was as if someone had cracked the foundation beneath them. The room shifted. Time bent. Jake couldn't breathe. "Got out?" he asked, barely able to believe it. "Yes," the man said, "but he never came back to the United States." Walter's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's impossible. I saw—" "That's exactly what they wanted you to see," the man interrupted. Jake turned to Walter. The old man's face had gone pale, drained of color. His eyes looked lost. The man continued slowly. "We believe Thomas Caldwell survived but disappeared. He didn't want to be found, and now we think we understand why." Walter swallowed hard. "Bill thinks I betrayed him." The man pulled out another folder and slid it across the table. Walter hesitated, then opened it with shaking hands. Inside were black and white photographs, grainy and taken from a distance. One showed a man in an old trench coat standing outside a cafe. Another captured a blurry figure moving through a crowded market. Jake leaned closer. The final photo made his stomach drop. An older man sat alone on a bench. His hair was white, his frame thinner, but his eyes, sharp, piercing, burned straight through the lens. Alive. A predator. Walter didn't need to ask. He already knew. And Jake could feel it too, even before Walter finally gave the smallest, heaviest nod of his life. Thomas Caldwell was still alive. Walter stared at the photo for so long that Jake feared he'd stopped breathing. But then a shaky breath escaped his lips, as though he had just exhaled a burden he'd carried alone for decades. "Ainley knows," Walter whispered. The man nodded. "We believe so." Jake's brow furrowed. "Knows what?" Walter didn't take his eyes off the photo. His voice trembled, but each word carried the weight of 74 years. "I'm still alive, that I was released, that I gave them his name." Jake sat in stunned silence, still trying to put the pieces together. Caldwell had survived. He had vanished. He had erased his identity from the world. No calls, no letters, no trace, only silence. Why? Walter turned to the next page in the folder. His fingers shook more now. Another document was tucked inside. A declassified report, yellowed and stamped with red ink. Jake leaned in to read. Subject: Thomas Caldwell. Status: missing. Last known location: Argentina. Suspected link: Operation Gladio. Jake blinked. "What's Operation Gladio?" The man in the suit met his eyes. "A post-war covert network. Officially, it was to resist the spread of communism, but in reality, many believe it was used to protect war criminals and conduct black ops that were never supposed to exist." Jake's chest tightened. "Are you saying Caldwell worked with them?" Walter shook his head. His voice was cold, razor sharp. "No, I think he was hunting them." Jake's breath caught. If that were true, it meant... Walter nodded as if hearing Jake's thoughts. It never left the war. Jake sat back in his chair, numb, while Walter had spent his life haunted by guilt, convinced that he had sent his friend to die. Caldwell had become a ghost in the dark, fighting a war that never ended, a war that had no uniforms and no boundaries. But if he was still alive, Jake asked, why didn't he ever come back? Walter's answer came softly. Because he didn't want to be found. The man in the suit leaned back in his chair. "Never knew what happened to Caldwell after the early 60s, he said. But 2 weeks ago, we got a lead." Jake's pulse jumped. "What kind of lead?" The man reached into his coat and slowly pulled out an aged envelope. The paper was brittle, the ink faded by time. He handed it to Walter. Walter's breath hitched. His fingers trembled as he took the envelope. The name written across the front, barely legible now, made Jake's blood run cold. Walter Hughes. Sender T. Caldwell. Jake's throat tightened. "You sent it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The man in the dark suit gave a slow nod. "We found it in a bank safety deposit box. It had been untouched for over 40 years. Walter held the envelope like it was a living thing, like it could burn him or break him. With slow, deliberate care, he opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile, like it had been waiting all these years for this very moment. His eyes welled up as he began to read aloud. "Walter, you lived, and so did I. But for me, the war never ended. I know what you did. I understand why you did it, why you had to survive. I chose to disappear. I no longer blame you. But that doesn't mean I can come back. If you're reading this, then I'm probably gone. But there's one thing you need to know. The reason they let you go, it wasn't what you thought. You weren't the betrayer, Walter. You were the one who was betrayed. Find the truth before the truth finds you." The last line hovered in the air like a warning, like a curse, or a key. Walter didn't speak. He sat there, still as stone, the letter trembling in his grasp. His fingers clutched it tightly, like it was a piece of his soul finally returned. His face was blank, but Jake could feel it. A storm was rising behind those old eyes, a storm that had been brewing for decades. Jake swallowed, his voice barely audible. "Jesus, what does that mean?" Walter's gaze dropped to the letter one more time, and when he looked up, something in his face had changed. The weariness was still there, but now it had hardened into purpose. "It means," he said, voice low and ominous, "this isn't over." He folded the letter slowly, reverently, and slid it back into the envelope. But it no longer felt like closure. It felt like the opening of a door to something deeper, darker. "For 74 years, Walter continued, I believed I was the one who betrayed my friend. I lived with that guilt every damn day." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "But now," Walter's voice turned colder, "now I know I was just a pawn. There was a bigger game, and I was played." Jake sat back, stunned. "You said you gave up Caldwell's name because they forced you to." Walter nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. That's what I believed. But what if—" He leaned forward, eyes sharp with new fury. "What if they already had his name before I said a word?" Jake felt a chill rush through him. "You're saying Caldwell was targeted from the start?" Walter nodded once, slowly. "I believe someone in our own unit sold him out before we were even captured." Jake froze, his stomach twisted. "There was a traitor?" Walter's voice was like steel. "I don't think. I know." He clenched his trembling hand into a fist. The rage he had buried for so long was now cracking the surface. "Who?" Jake asked, almost afraid to hear the name. Walter's jaw tightened, his teeth ground together. "In the Captain Leonard Mason." The name hit the table like a dropped hammer. Pierce, the man in the suit, visibly flinched. "Mason?" he asked, his voice tense. "Are you sure?" Walter let out a bitter laugh. "I'd bet my life on it, and almost did." Jake was shaking. "But he was your commanding officer." "Exactly," Walter said. "That's why he could hide everything so well. He had access, authority, and he used it to lead us into a trap." Jake blinked, not trusting what he was hearing. "You're saying he sent you into enemy territory on purpose?" Walter nodded, no hesitation now. "I believe Mason orchestrated the whole thing. He needed to make sure Thomas Caldwell never walked out of that camp alive." Pierce frowned. "Mason's war record is spotless, decorated, commendations, medals." "Exactly," Walter snapped. That's how you bury the truth, in gold. Jake leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. But why? What did Caldwell know? Walter looked at both men, his eyes burning with quiet resolve. That's exactly what we need to find out. Pierce stood slowly, his hand resting on the folder he had brought. Mason's records are sealed, deep. But if what you're saying is true, he hesitated. There's a hell of a lot more buried beneath those commendations. Walter nodded. Then it's time we dig it up. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. Mason must be dead by now, right? He asked. Pierce smirked, but it wasn't a smile. Officially, yeah. Jake tensed. And unofficially? Pierce shrugged. Men like Mason. Powerful men. They have a way of disappearing, especially when the past starts chasing them. Walter's breath came heavy but steady. Then we find him, or we find whoever's still protecting him. Jake's hands clenched until his knuckles turned white. That morning, he'd thought Walter Hughes was just an old man wasting away in silence. But now he saw the soldier still inside him, the fight in his eyes, the fire that had never gone out. And for the first time in decades, Walter Hughes wasn't fighting alone. Walter turned to Jake. You in? Jake didn't hesitate. Hell yes. Walter looked to Pierce. His voice was steel, forged in 74 years of pain. And let's finish what was started all those years ago. Pierce nodded, eyes sharp. First step, we find out what happened to Leonard Mason. Walter stood, slower than he once would have, but straighter than anyone expected. His frame may have aged, but his spine, his will, was unbroken. Let's go dig up a ghost. For the first time in over half a century, Walter Hughes felt alive. He had spent years as a shadow, an invisible remnant of a war no one talked about, a man keeping a solemn promise through lonely meals and silent mornings. But now, he had a new mission. Jake had never seen him move with such purpose. Each step he took out of the diner was filled with weight, history, pain, and resolve, all pressing forward into the unknown. Rain poured from the heavens, drenching the streets in silver sheets, but they didn't flinch. The storm wasn't outside. It was inside them. Daniel Pierce finally offered his full name, ushering them into a dark sedan parked near the curb. As they pulled away from the diner, water slicing under the tires, he spoke softly but firmly. Mason vanished decades ago, but his name, it's been erased from the records, sanitized. That only means one thing. He looked into the rearview mirror, locking eyes with Walter. Was part of something bigger. Walter nodded grimly, eyes locked on the window. Caldwell knew that, and they tried to bury him for it. From the back seat, Jake leaned forward. So where do we start? Pierce tapped a rhythm on the steering wheel, deep in thought. I traced every file linked to Mason, every document, every lead. Only one name kept showing up in connection with his disappearance. He looked back at them again. Richard Holloway. Walter froze. Holloway? He whispered, the name catching in his throat like a fragment of a dream returning too suddenly. Jake frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. That name sounds familiar. But Walter wasn't listening to Jake. His voice dropped into a whisper, barely audible beneath the weight of memory. James Holloway. He was my best friend. A silence followed that statement. Thick. Aching. 4 people who were losing everything. Exciting and filled with doubt. Thick. Aching. It filled the car like fog. Pierce finally broke it, his voice low and careful. Richard Holloway is his son. The words landed like a bullet straight through Walter's chest. He didn't respond. Couldn't. His hands clenched involuntarily, knuckles pale, his breath hitched. James had a son. A son who had unknowingly been following the same trail of truth that Walter had spent a lifetime running from. An hour later, they pulled up outside a modest law office on the outskirts of town. The sign above the door was simple, hand-carved, Holloway and Associates. Walter's heart thudded in his chest as they stepped inside. A brass bell chimed softly above the door, and the scent of old paper and stale coffee washed over them. It was oddly comforting, like time had slowed. The receptionist eyed them curiously. "Can I help you?" Pierre stepped forward, calm and composed. "We're here to see Richard Holloway." Minutes passed like hours until a tall man with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes entered the room. He looked to be in his early 60s. His face was lined with a kind of quiet sorrow that only those who've carried long-buried truths wear like a second skin. He stopped short when he saw Walter. The two men stared at each other, generations apart yet bound by the same wound. Then Richard spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "I know who you are." Walter swallowed hard, struggling to keep steady. "Then you know why I'm here." Richard nodded. "I do, and I have something for you." He disappeared into his office and returned moments later with a weathered leather journal. He placed it gently on the table between them. "It belonged to my father. I found it after my mother passed." Walter reached out with trembling hands, fingers brushing the cracked leather as if he were touching James himself. Slowly, reverently, he opened the book. The handwriting was unmistakable. James Holloway. Jake and Pierce stood silent as Walter flipped through the pages, every turn another wave crashing over decades of pain. Then he stopped. A single passage had been underlined in faded blue ink. "Nation has been compromised. I don't trust him. If anything happens, tell Hughes to never stop looking. The truth is buried, but not dead." Walter's breath caught. His hand covered his mouth as his eyes welled with tears. "James. He tried to protect me." Richard nodded, voice steady. "He did, and I don't believe his death was an accident." Over the weeks that followed, the three men pieced together the remnants of a truth too long hidden. Declassified documents, buried intelligence, whispered names from behind locked doors, connections only Pierce could access through his contacts in places most men never see. And finally, the truth emerged. Leonard Mason had been a double agent. He sold out military secrets in exchange for wealth, influence, and the protection of shadows. When Thomas Caldwell uncovered the betrayal, he became a threat that had to be silenced. So Mason staged the ambush, a slaughter disguised as misfortune, an erasure. But Caldwell survived, and Mason spent decades running from that truth. Pierce traced the money, the offshore accounts, shell corporations, unregistered aliases. Finally, a single name surfaced. A life lived under false identities. Leonard Mason, living in Spain. Jake's fists clenched so tightly his fingernails dug into his palms. "He's alive." Pierce's voice was cold and resolute, but not for much longer. Walter inhaled sharply. His entire life he had believed himself to be the villain, a coward, a traitor. Now he had a chance to reclaim the truth. 3 months later, Leonard Mason was arrested in Madrid. The world watched in stunned disbelief as headlines exposed the rot hidden beneath the medals. A man once praised as a hero had been, all along, the architect of betrayal, of blood. And Walter Hughes, the man who had once buried his own name beneath decades of guilt, was hailed as what he always had been, a hero. His honor was restored, his story finally told. But more than that, he had kept his promise, not just to James, not just to Caldwell, but to himself. That day, the little diner on Maple Street was packed wall to wall, not for the food, not for the coffee, but for the man who, for 74 years, had eaten in silence. Today, Walter didn't sit alone. Jake placed the plate down gently in front of him. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, a square of cornbread, and a black coffee. Walter smiled, warm and bittersweet. They would have liked this. Jake grinned. No doubt. Pierce raised his glass of water with a quiet reverence. To the ghosts we carry, and the battles we still fight. Walter lifted his coffee, hands steady, voice strong. To the ones we never forget. And for the first time in 74 years, the meal no longer tasted like penance. It tasted like freedom, like forgiveness, like home.